This is Module 3, Part 1, Lecture Part 1. Okay, want to go over a test before we do anything else. So, there's no other way to do a take-home test. You got it sitting in front of you, so you you immediately see there's diagrams there. I told you, if you draw, not only would you get extra credit, but you learn in the process, and it'll help for the test as well. But it's the learning. I'm telling you, you will be surprised as you draw these things. If you do that, what you get out of it, what you learn, and you'll say to yourself, "I didn't know I knew that," and you will. So, that's pretty much. You see, that's pretty straightforward stuff. I don't ask you stuff that's not in your notes. I don't test you over stuff that's not there. If you're familiar with it, you should be able to think through what the questions are. Some of them require you to think a little bit, to go to your notes and sort of think about what I'm asking. But other than that, you did well. Everybody did, for the most part, pretty well on your first exam. Is there any questions about the material from Module 2? Anything at all? Alrighty. Again, mostly about connective tissue and epithelium, right? So, because we'll get to the other tissue as we go. So, everybody has an opinion, and I like this module, what we're heading into. Some of them I like, some of them I'm just, I'm okay with. But this is the integumentary and skeletal systems. We're introducing the skeletal system here, and we'll deal with the skeletal system in greater detail in the next module, but we introduce it here, and I just think the bones are interesting. The leg bones connected to the hip bone, and that's as technical as we'll get. No, I'm kidding. We'll study through the skeleton, and we have it right back there. Thank you very much. Eduardo is here to reveal these things to us. And then, of course, the skin, which is an interesting discussion in and of itself. So, questions? You should have a total of 4 pages of notes, front and back on the first 3, and front for the last one, page 7. So make sure you have that. I'm on page 61, and you will find, remember how we introduced the course. I had you writing some definitions as we went through, told you that you wouldn't be doing much of that the further we went. We still will from time to time, but the point of writing those definitions was to get you into the textbook, to become familiar with the textbook, to learn to read through it. This is an older version of anatomy, and the reason I use this textbook is because I like it so well. There's newer stuff with regards to human anatomy, but nothing so, not even close to anything so important. There hasn't been dramatic discoveries in the 15 or so years that this textbook was written. But it's so very well done, and with some humor as well. I think it's really readable. So please do read through it in addition to your notes. You're responsible for your notes, but the textbook fleshes it out as well. All right, on page 61, there's a pretty little picture which we'll refer to as we introduce this thing. So the integumentary system is the skin, and that provides protection. Sometimes you don't think of your skin as a vital aspect of your protection. You do if you ever get out and burn it bad. Oh yeah, you recognize, number one, the pain, and then you recognize indeed how vital that skin is to you. It protects you from the sun, from thermal stress, and from infections. Maybe infections as important as anything, and again, you recognize how important that is if your skin becomes compromised. If you bake in the sun too long, and how prone you are to infection as a result, or of course if you cut yourself or whatever else. The skin is very tough. The thinnest of our skin is over our eyelids, It's 1/50th of an inch. The thickest is over the back and shoulders. It's roughly 1/5 of an inch thick. So you think about that in terms of 1/4 inch is about yay, and just a little bit less than that, you know, that's pretty thick skin. It stretches, it's waterproof, it's self-conditioning, it's self-mending, it cools the body some by sweating. That's what that nasty sweat is all about. It's designed to cool you down when you're hot. So the basic structure of the skin, it's made up of the skin and appendages to the skin. And what we mean by that is glands, hair, and nails. So yes, nails are part of the skin. Interesting. So skin is composed of 2 layers. Skin has layers like ogres. It has the epidermis and the dermis. And if you are on page 61, as I have requested, you see what I'm talking about there. The epidermis is the kind of light goldish greenish thing there on top, and the dermis is below in the aqua sort of color. So you have epidermis and dermis that composes the skin. So let's make some statements about those things. Number 1, the epidermis is the outer portion of the skin. It's formed by stratified squamous cells. Those are epithelial tissue which rests on top of the dermis. We looked at that the last time, remember? And in terms of those stratified cells, the layers of those cells as well. The dermis is dense, irregular connective tissue that forms the deep layer of the skin. There is the papillary layer. So look at that layer there. And again, in terms of your pictures, the drawing here, the papillary layer is the green that's kind of inside the little arches things there. But that's sort of an interesting thing. It's those bumps. It's the dermal papillae. Papilla is the singular of that, whose function is to increase the amount of blood vessels exposed to the vascular epidermis. So, you know what? Let me see here. Yeah, exposed to the epidermis. Sorry about this. Yeah, that's what I wanted. All right. Let's continue. Epidermal ridges. Are they displayed for us? They are not. So the epidermal ridges are small ridges of epidermal tissue that make up the fingerprints. So yeah, the function is to increase the friction between the skin and the things that are touched in order to grasp things. So the hands and the feet have deeper epidermal ridges than other parts of the body. The epidermal ridges are made up of lines of dermal papillae. Those are bumps in the dermis. They line up to form ridges, and the effect upon the skin is like throwing a blanket over toys. I like that picture. They use that in the book. So if you your mom tells you to get in there and clean up your room, and so you take a blanket and you throw it over the stuff that you've piled up in your room, and there it is. It's all cleaned up, right? Well, the ridges that's kind of formed in terms of that blanket over your stuff are like those ridges, and again, for the purpose of being able to grasp. Anybody here ever accidentally, had a fall or a terrible abrasion where you severely scraped the skin on your fingers? Like that. So number 1, it hurts like fire. Number 2, in terms of until you heal, just trying to pick something up, there's that smooth as opposed to just a little bit of something there that allows you to grasp as opposed to not having those ridges. So interesting, again, the way God makes us. The reticular layer beneath the papillary layer, you see that. So there's the papillary layer, there's the reticular layer, and the depiction of that is on the right side of that image there on page 61. Beneath the papillary layer is a network, reti means net, of protein fibers composed of dense, irregular connective tissue that gives strength to the skin in all directions for it to stretch without tearing. So, and that is quite an interesting characteristic of skin, isn't it? You can stretch and pull on it a lot, and it does not tear. All right. Sometimes obviously it can, but in terms of its strength that way, it is simply remarkable. The reticular layer do not line up like dense, regular connective tissue. They are still lined up a little in one direction to allow for lines of cleavage, also known as lines of tension. That wasn't a hand raise, was it? That was just a stretch. Turn over to page 68 and look at that weird looking guy. Ooh, got lines all over him. Ooh.
68?
63. Page 63.
You said 8.
Pardon?
You said 8.
I did?
I think so.
Sorry about that. 63.
Is that 68? It's 68.
Thank you. Look at those lines of cleavage. Isn't that interesting? You know, you've looked at your hands and your skin your whole life, and in terms of it, unless you've taken the time to Google it or look it up, the lines of cleavage there have to do with the way the skin is oriented in terms of these connective tissue. Again, it's regular in one sense to allow for these lines in your hands, but it's also irregular in the sense that they all don't go in the same direction. And you see the display there in terms of the drawing on page 63. And it sort of makes sense in terms of the way that your skin folds and in terms of the movement of your limbs, as well as your hands and feet and toes and fingers. So in one direction or another, to allow for lines of cleavage or lines of tension that point out the overall direction of the collagen fibers that stretch and pull along those lines. Now, what you've also found out is that if you cut across the lines of cleavage, the cut is pulled apart and it heals more slowly and often produces a pretty significant scar. But if you cut parallel to the lines of cleavage, there is little stress on that cut, and it doesn't open as much, and it heals much faster, very often without scarring. And so some of you have noticed that in your life as well. So if, just for the point of illustration, I was probably 5 years old and at the beach and having a great time, and felt something happen to my leg right about where, in terms of the depiction there on page 63, the cut is showing there on the bottom when a cut goes across the lines of cleavage. Well, that's what happened to me. I had a cut that went right there on a piece of coral. and that sucker bled like you would not believe. And in fact, so much so that we couldn't get it stopped and had to go home and get Band-Aids and that sort of thing. Well, I still have the scar from that. It's, you know, I was 5 or 6 years old. And the reason is that went right across the lines of cleavage. It pulled further apart. It took a long time to stop bleeding. It took a good long time to heal. We didn't go for stitches back then, but it did heal. But the bottom line is the fascinating aspects of cleavage in terms of injury or wound. Any of you, some of you will have surgery perhaps sometimes on your abdomen, and you know the way that you want to have surgery, or at least the incision, if it's at all possible, is to go across. Notice the line of cleavage. In terms of hysterectomy or some sort of abdominal surgery that requires more than something arthroscopic, you know, the little camera version of surgery. But the bottom line is if they cut across, the scar isn't as apparent and it heals faster. But if they have to go straight down, man, oh man, will you have a scar, and it will take some time, and it will involve some pain as well. A blister is a separation between the dermis and the epidermis. So one more time, if you look at page 61, so when you have a blister, what you've done is, in terms of some form of friction that you have applied to that thing, you're out there working in the garden, working hard, and with a shovel or whatever it is, a hoe, and then you wake up the next day and you got these blisters all over your hands, and what's happened is, in terms of the friction there, you have a separation between those two layers, and you end up with that blister. All right, the hypodermis. Would you turn a little bit further to page 64 now? Another pretty picture. Pretty pictures that you can draw. Some of you have. Give you credit. The hypodermis, look at the thing all the way to the bottom. So you see the epidermis depicted there as well at the top, the dermis in the middle. All right, and look at the hypodermis all the way to the bottom. And if you'll notice all the way to the right, it says adipose tissue. There's a lot of that, a lot of fat tissue in this particular layer. Well, can be. Hypodermis is loose connective tissue underneath the dermis, which connects the dermis to muscle or bone. And actually, the hypodermis is not part of the skin. Sounds like it. So it's got the word dermis in it. So in that skin? No. It's hypodermis. And some of you know about the hypodermis because you've had injections into the hypodermis. Or you've had an injection called something called sub-Q, and that's what we're talking about. In terms of years ago, we used to give vaccinations. I worked for a vet for a while, and we used to give vaccinations sub-Q, which was right underneath their skin. And so what would happen is you'd see a little swelling as a result of injecting the vaccine into that area. And they still do sub-Q injections. More often you get them in the muscle, but in any respect, that's the hypodermis. Cow leather, you're familiar with that, is made from dermis. All right, from cow dermis. So that gives you an idea too in terms of the makeup of things. So there's nerves located in the dermis, and they send signals to and receive signals from the brain and spinal cord. There are hair follicle receptors, nerves that wrap around the hair, designed to